The autumn term dinner at St. Augustine's Old Scholars' Society had always been a mildly ceremonial affair, the sort of carefully preserved tradition that lent the institution its air of venerable calm. The school, set upon a hill overlooking a sweep of cedar and slate-colored river, wore the season's dusk like an old robe. Lanterns glowed along the cloister walkways. Silvered laughter drifted through the open windows of the great hall, and the assembled alumni, polished like the silver on the tables, spoke in that cultivated blend of nostalgia and self-possession that St. Augustine's so reliably produced. Inspector Roderick Alleyn, invited as a guest of Sir Julian Rathbone, a retired general of pleasant pomposity, found himself observing the scene with his usual mild detachment. He leaned against an oak-paneled pillar at the edge of the hall, listening, watching, gathering the subtler vibrations of the room. It was not an official investigation, merely a social duty, but Alleyn's professional sensibilities rarely slept. Sir Julian was in the midst of recounting for the fourth or fifth time a story about the school's former fencing master when Alleyn's attention drifted toward the dais, where the evening's ostensible guest of honor presided. Lady Margaret Elphinstone, a celebrated painter, widow of a baronet, and former St. Augustine's art mistress, shimmered in the glow of the candles. Her pale dress seemed too delicate for the heavy room, and her manner, though sweet, carried a faint tension that suggested her presence this evening was an obligation rather than a joy. She smiled dutifully at Lord Aubrey Northcote, who had been leaning close to her for most of the dinner, murmuring reminiscences and compliments with an enthusiasm that felt just a little off-key. Between them sat Clarissa Fielding, once Lady Margaret's star pupil, now a rising theatrical designer whose recent success in London had made her something of a society darling. Clarissa's beauty was sharp rather than soft, her expression too thoughtful, her glances too swiftly diverted. Several old boys had attempted to engage her in conversation. Each withdrew with the impression of having intruded upon some private worry. At the lower tables, a cluster of younger alumni, recent graduates in their early 20s, whispered among themselves, casting furtive glances toward the high table. The most conspicuous of these was Jasper Linford, an aspiring actor whose dramatic posture suggested that he never forgot an audience. His companion, Edmund Stoyle, was a more diffident presence, quiet, neatly dressed, with the air of a young man accustomed to being overshadowed. Alleyn noted these small human arrangements with the practiced grace of one who had spent his life observing polite facades. Nothing here was amiss, or rather, nothing that would qualify in any official sense. But that faint sense of strain beneath the evenings. Conviviality was unmistakable. He was just considering an unobtrusive retreat to the anteroom for a cigarette when the school's headmaster, Mr. Crispin Donnelly, rose to give the closing speech. Donnelly was a slight man with a charm that fell just short of confidence, but his devotion to the school bestowed upon him a quiet dignity. He spoke of achievements, legacies, upcoming restorations to the old buildings, and the work of Lady Margaret, whose recent donation of paintings was to be unveiled after dinner. At the mention, she inclined her head with a small, tight smile. "And finally," Donnelly concluded, "I hope you will all join us for a brief tour of the old dormitory wing, where Lady Margaret's early works will be displayed. The space has been unused for some years, as many of you may remember. A place full of history, some of it," he added with a light laugh, "perhaps best left to memory." The room answered with polite chuckles. Beside Alleyn, Sir Julian harumphed. "Dashed odd choice, that wing. Damp as a bog. I shouldn't think anyone's been in those rooms for decades." "Except perhaps the ghosts of schoolmasters past," Alleyn murmured. Sir Julian blinked, then chuckled heartily. "Yes, quite." The procession began to form, chairs scraping, conversation spilling into the aisles. Lady Margaret stood with a composed grace that nevertheless seemed to cost her some effort. Clarissa Fielding touched her arm, a gesture too quickly withdrawn to be casual. Lord Aubrey's smile sharpened. Alleyn followed the group through the cloisters, the lantern light trembling over faces both nostalgic and strained. The old dormitory wing stood apart from the main building, accessible through a narrow passage where the stone chilled noticeably. The air seemed to hush as they entered. "This way, everyone," Donnelly said, holding a lantern aloft. Alleyn let the crowd drift ahead, lingering near the rear with the instinct of a man who preferred to observe before engaging. As they approached the first doorway, he heard a sudden intake of breath, sharp but quickly stifled. Clarissa had halted just inside the threshold, her gloved hand pressed to her mouth. Lady Margaret, pale in the lantern glow, stood frozen beside her. Lord Aubrey's voice floated back, uncertain. "What on earth? Margaret, my dear, are you—" But it was Donnelly's alarmed cry that sliced through the murmurs. "Good Lord, someone fetch help!" Alleyn stepped forward then, moving past the cluster of whispers and startled faces. The room ahead was small, unused, the dust heavy, the air stale. And there, in the center, collapsed beside one of Lady Margaret's draped canvases, lay a man. Young, dressed in evening clothes. Unmoving. Edmund Stoyle. What struck Alleyn first was the stillness. No violence, no sign of panic, the sort of death that seemed almost apologetic in its arrival. He knelt, touched two fingers, the young man's wrist, and felt what he already knew. Behind him, silence pooled like cold water. The elegant evening had fractured, but quietly, like fine porcelain cracking beneath a gloved hand. The hush that fell upon the old dormitory wing was almost reverential, as though the dust-heavy air itself had absorbed the shock of Edmund Stoyle's sudden collapse. Lantern light trembled across the uneven floorboards, illuminating the pale, still figure in a manner that was strangely intimate, almost accusatory. Alleyn remained kneeling for a moment, noting the absence of struggle, the precise placement of the young man's hands, the slight slack of his jaw. There was no scream, no sign of panic, only the silent assertion of death. Lady Margaret stepped forward cautiously, her fingers brushing the edge of a canvas as if she might steady the scene through gentle contact. He was fine just a moment ago," she murmured, her voice almost swallowed by the heavy air. "We were speaking. He seemed well—" The words faltered at the end, as if recognition of their insufficiency had robbed them of sound. Clarissa Fielding remained frozen, her gloved hands clasped tightly in front of her. Alleyn observed the tension behind her measured expression. A flicker of guilt, quickly masked, betrayed itself in the almost imperceptible tightening of her shoulders. Lord Aubrey stepped forward, though his movements were uncertain. Hesitant, a man aware that any motion might be construed as culpability. Alleyn rose slowly to his feet, his manner composed, courteous, though the detective's mind had already begun its quiet work. "If no one minds," he said evenly, "I should like to ensure that nothing is disturbed before we understand precisely what we are dealing with." His eyes swept the room with the calm certainty of one accustomed to reading the story that a scene had already told long before a word was spoken. The space itself contributed to the sense of subdued horror. The dormitory was a relic of the late Victorian age, narrow, high-ceilinged rooms lined with rows of small beds, each dusted with age and neglect. The walls, once white, were now faintly yellowed, streaked with the shadows of water stains. Lady Margaret's canvases had been leaned casually against the walls, their frames catching the lantern light like cold eyes observing the scene. The air smelled faintly of mildew, varnish, and something harder to place, the unmistakable scent of a life extinguished too quietly. Sir Julian Rathbone had finally recovered enough composure to speak. No marks, nothing broken, not a sound. His tone carried the vague indignation of a man unused to mortality presenting itself so politely. How can this be? A fainting, perhaps? Alleyn's gaze lingered on Edmund's hands. Fainting does not usually produce this stillness, he said softly, his voice carrying neither judgment nor alarm, merely observation. And he was alone for only a very short while, it seems. That is seldom coincidental. Clarissa's voice trembled slightly as she interjected. I was with him, almost at the door. We spoke about the display. He was enthusiastic, alive. Then, her words faltered, a shadow of disbelief crossing her features. Alleyn's attention shifted to the minor details of the room, the things a casual observer might overlook. The slight tilt of a chair, a smudge of dust on the floor suggesting recent movement, the faint fragrance of cologne, unremarkable but familiar in its personal specificity. He noted, too, the absence of footprints leading from the nearest door to the body, as if the young man had never struggled. A murmur ran through the small assembly at the doorway, a mix of polite horror and tentative speculation. Lady Margaret touched his arm lightly. "Inspector, what does it mean?" Her tone was low, tremulous, but controlled. Alleyn's reply was careful. "At this stage, it means that someone has died quietly and that the circumstances are unusual enough to merit attention. That is all we can say for now." He allowed a pause, letting his words settle among them like the faint dust motes in the lantern light. He then drew his eyes away from the body and swept the room in a quiet, methodical scan, noting the posture and expressions of each person present. It was always the living who betrayed more than the dead. In their gestures, their half-formed sentences, the briefest flicker of unease. And here, in the subdued elegance of the old dormitory wing, Alleyn felt the tension thrum faintly beneath the polished surface of polite grief. "Please," he said finally, addressing the assembled group with the calm courtesy of a man accustomed to authority earned through observation rather than force. "Step back for a moment. Allow me to ensure that nothing is disturbed. Then we will proceed carefully." As the small crowd obeyed, whispering in hushed tones and exchanging glances that blended curiosity, fear, and speculation, Alleyn felt the first faint shift in the currents of the evening. It was subtle. A hesitation, a glance held too long, a hand that trembled for an instant before retreating. The machinery of social grace and restrained panic was beginning to turn, and, with it, the true nature of the night's tragedy would slowly, inevitably, begin to emerge. In that quiet stillness, Alleyn understood that the death itself had not screamed, but the room already was. Alleyn stood near the threshold of the old dormitory wing, his posture composed, his expression courteous yet vigilant. The assembled alumni, Lady Margaret and Sir Julian, lingered at the rear, their whispers hushed as if the very walls demanded discretion. The lantern light fell upon Edmund Stoyle's still form, illuminating the slight tension in the lines of his face, the carefully folded hands, the untroubled expression of one who had departed without struggle. It was the silence, above all, that struck Alleyn. Not the absence of sound in the usual sense, but the way the silence carried the weight of observation. Each person in the room was performing civility as though it were a duty. Yet beneath the practiced calm, the undercurrents of unease flowed with a quiet persistence. Alleyn's gaze settled first on Lady Margaret. Her hands, though steady, were slightly pale where her fingers met the edge of the nearest canvas. She spoke to no one, yet every movement of her head and shoulders seemed to negotiate her place in the unfolding scene. He noted the tension in her jaw, the subtle furrow of her brow, a mind accustomed to concealing emotion, yet betraying concern in the briefest of gestures. Clarissa Fielding, standing just behind her, maintained a careful distance from the body. Her gloved hands were tightly clasped, the posture practiced but not entirely natural. Alleyn observed the flicker of unease in her eyes, a rapid scanning of the room that suggested both curiosity and fear. Lord Aubrey Northcote hovered near her, speaking softly in tones that seemed intended to soothe, but she gave no reply. His concern was genuine, but the polite restraint with which he carried it betrayed a man aware of appearances first and sentiment second. Sir Julian Rathbone, ever the figure of deliberate composure, was now shifting from foot to foot, muttering quietly about the implausibility of the young man's sudden death. He gestured toward the body with one gloved hand, then drew it back, as though the sight might soil him. Alleyn noted the habitual formality in every motion, an officer's bearing retained even in the presence of death. Alleyn's attention, however, lingered not only on those gathered, but on the room itself. The dormitory was an archive of minor human histories, narrow beds with once pristine covers, now faded, worn floorboards bearing the faint impressions of footsteps long past, an air tinged with the lingering scent of varnish and old timber. The arrangement of Lady Margaret's canvases was casual, yet deliberate. No painting leaned too precariously. No object lay out of place. A world that, to the unobservant eye, seemed merely neglected, but to one trained in nuance suggested careful orchestration. He noticed the small things first, a dust-free spot on a chair that suggested it had been recently moved, a single footprint smudged into the faint layer of dust along the floorboards, the faint crease of a glove left on the edge of a table. Each of these was a fragment of story, a silent witness to actions unspoken. Alleyn allowed a brief moment for the initial flurry of shock to settle. He then addressed the group with calm authority, speaking in tones designed not to startle or command, but to invite careful observation. "It is important that no one touches anything or attempts to move the body," he said. "We must preserve the room exactly as it is, for the smallest detail may prove significant." He stepped closer to the body, noting with quiet precision the arrangement of Edmund's clothing, the slight indentation of his form against the polished floor, the absence of any indication of struggle or injury. Death, Alleyn reflected, sometimes left more questions than answers when it arrived with such quiet inevitability. When he straightened, his eyes swept the assembled guests again, lingering on the interactions he had already begun to pass. Subtle cues revealed alliances, tensions, and fears. Lady Margaret's slight recoil when Clarissa's gaze lingered too long. Lord Aubrey's careful attention to Lady Margaret rather than the body. Sir Julian's persistent muttering to himself, masking something he did not wish to articulate. Even the young alumni near the doorway, whispering in hushed tones, betrayed impatience beneath their deference. Alleyn said nothing more at that moment, preferring to let observation work its slow magic. Questions could come later, when the room was steadied, when the living had had time to settle into their roles in a drama they scarcely realized was beginning. For now, he watched, and in watching, the faintest traces of the evening's true pattern began to emerge. Gestures held too long, words withheld, glances diverted. It was, as he thought, in these subtle fractures beneath the veneer of civility that the first threads of truth would be revealed. And Alleyn, as always, intended to see them clearly before a single question was asked. Alleyn's method was quiet, deliberate. He did not summon the living to formal questioning, nor did he demand answers from those whose composure hung by a delicate thread. Instead, he moved through the corridors of the old dormitory wing as though he were part of the scenery, listening, observing, and speaking only when civility demanded it. In these hushed interactions, he collected fragments of motive, subtle as dust in a sunbeam, yet no less telling for their invisibility. He first approached Lady Margaret, who lingered beside a narrow window, her hand lightly pressed against the cold pane. She turned at his voice, offering a composed, though fleetingly uncertain, smile. "Lady Margaret," he began, "I wonder if you might recall the last time you saw Edmund before this moment." His tone was gentle, imbued with the calm that often coaxed the truth without seeming intrusive. She drew in a quiet breath, eyes shifting to the polished floorboards. "We spoke briefly before the tour began," she said. "He seemed impatient, eager to see the display. Quite unlike him, I thought, for he is usually reserved. She paused, then added with a faint tremor, "But that is all, Inspector. I cannot imagine. Her voice faltered at the last, a carefully held edge of grief. Alleyn nodded. He neither pressed nor probed. There was meaning in the pause, in the things left unsaid, in the hesitation that trembled like a shadow at the edge of her composure. Clarissa Fielding was next, standing near the doorway with Lord Aubrey hovering uneasily behind her. Alleyn approached with the same unobtrusive calm, noting the subtle tension in her posture, the gloved fingers twisting almost imperceptibly. "Miss Fielding," he said, "you were near the door when the incident occurred. Could you tell me what you observed?" She inclined her head, keeping her gaze fixed on a spot just beyond his shoulder. I'd only just entered the wing. Edmund, he spoke of the paintings. And then he seemed suddenly unwell. I called for help immediately." Her voice was steady, but Alleyn observed the way she glanced briefly toward Lord Aubrey, then away, as though the presence of another might alter the truth she offered. "Did he say anything unusual? Mention anything that troubled him?" Alleyn asked softly. Clarissa shook her head. "Nothing at all, Inspector. I assure you, he seemed quite ordinary. Quite ordinary until he collapsed." She pressed her gloved hands together with a faint, almost unconscious force. Lord Aubrey Northcote was the final figure Alleyn approached at that moment. The young man's usual confidence appeared diminished, replaced by polite apprehension. I was with Miss Fielding for a few moments," he said. "We discussed the paintings. Nothing more." He seemed, well, as one might say, unremarkable. He faltered, then added with faint defensiveness, "I assure you, I know nothing that could explain this." Alleyn allowed the words to hang in the air. The young man's tone was sincere, yet the careful shaping of sentences, the repeated insistence on ordinariness, suggested a mind keenly aware of appearances. Often, he thought, those who protest too readily are not entirely free of involvement. The rest of the small assembly whispered among themselves, avoiding eye contact, their movements constrained by both etiquette and the weight of a sudden, shared unease. Alleyn observed that even Sir Julian, though outwardly gruff, kept his comments in measured murmur, revealing little but betraying curiosity in the lingering curl of his lip. Throughout these discreet conversations, Alleyn noted not only what was said, but, more importantly, what remained unspoken. The smallest gesture, a tilt of the head, a glance diverted, a hand lightly brushing the seam of a jacket, conveyed a wealth of information. Politeness, he knew, was often the first layer to crack under pressure. Beneath it lay the texture of motive and fear, alliances and secrets. He withdrew then to the rear of the room, letting the gathering continue in their subdued arrangement. Observing, he thought, was often more telling than questioning. People reveal themselves in the spaces between words, in the fleeting tension of a smile, the hesitation of a hand extended. And in this quiet dance of civility and concealment, the outlines of the night's mystery were beginning to emerge. Delicate, intricate, and nearly imperceptible to anyone untrained in the subtleties of human behavior. Alleyn allowed himself a private note of satisfaction. The threads were present, waiting only for the careful mind to weave them into a pattern. And in this he was patient, as all great detectives must be. For the truth does not rush itself, nor does it flourish beneath the glare of impatience. Alleyn stepped quietly from the dormitory wing into the narrow service corridor that ran along the rear of the old school. The hum of polite concern still lingered in the main hall. But here, in the dim lamplight, the atmosphere was different. Quieter, more watchful. He knew from long experience that the servants of such households often held knowledge far more precise than the social guests, though they spoke rarely and only when necessary. Their discretion was born of duty, habit, and the subtle hierarchies of loyalty. A slender figure appeared at the far end of the corridor, a maid whose tenure at St. Augustine's had been measured in decades. Her hands were folded neatly, and she gave a slight curtsy at the sight of Alleyn, her eyes sharp beneath the veil of age and propriety. "Inspector," she said softly, her voice carrying a tone of respectful caution, "is there anything I can do?" Alleyn inclined his head, letting his gaze linger on her for a moment longer than courtesy required. "I should like to know what you observed before the incident, Miss—" "Briggs, sir. Ethel Briggs," she replied. "I was tidying the passage near the east wing when I noticed Master Stoyle arriving with Miss Fielding and Lord Aubrey. They spoke for a brief moment, and then—" Her words faltered. She pressed her lips together, eyes downcast, yet her grip on the broom she carried betrayed tension beneath calm. "And then?" Alleyn prompted softly. Ethel lifted her eyes, though she did not look directly at him. "Then he went into the dormitory. I did not follow. I thought the young man merely wanted to see the display. And when I heard the cry—" She shook her head, brushing at the handle of the broom as if to reclaim composure. "I came immediately, but I saw nothing. Only that he had collapsed." Alleyn made no comment. There was truth in her words, yet something held back, something unspoken. He had observed this many times. The careful servant, whose loyalty or fear or prudence made the disclosure of certain details unthinkable, even when they might clarify events. Often, it was what they didn't say that carried significance. A short distance away, the housekeeper emerged from the shadows, her posture immaculate, gloves pristine, as if the very act of standing straight could maintain order against disorder. "Inspector Alleyn," she said, with a voice measured, precise, and faintly distant, "I have seen to the preparations here and ensured that nothing in the dormitory was disturbed. If you require anything further—" Her sentence trailed, leaving an implicit reservation. Alleyn observed the slight stiffness of her movements, the careful avoidance of the east side where the body had lain. "You were here when Master Stoyle arrived?" he asked. "Only in the distance, sir. It is customary to remain out of the way of our alumni." Her eyes, however, flicked briefly to a spot on the floor where a faint scuff marred the otherwise immaculate boards. A detail unnoticed by casual observers, but noted by the detective. Alleyn nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mrs. Havisham. Your diligence is appreciated." He lingered a moment longer, walking the corridor with measured steps. He noted the quiet rhythm of the household, the slight creak of floorboards under invisible weight, the distant echo of a closing door, the hushed tones of servants attending to tasks that could wait for 100 other reasons yet seemed urgent in the subtle urgency of tonight. Each motion, each hesitation, was a potential thread to the fabric of the evening's tragedy. It was clear to Alleyn that the servants knew more than they revealed. There was no malevolence in this concealment, only prudence, the ingrained habit of discretion. They would not betray secrets lightly, even to an inspector. And yet, he did not need words to understand that their silence held a significance that the outwardly calm faces of the alumni could not conceal. Returning to the dormitory wing, Alleyn allowed himself a small inward reflection. In such households, in these carefully cultivated circles, truth often traveled along hidden paths. The servants observed, remembered, and preserved knowledge in ways the upper-class participants would scarcely imagine. In time, when the story's edges had settled, these quiet witnesses would provide the hints necessary to connect the outward appearances to the inward motives. For now, however, he watched, quietly noting each glance, each hesitant step. The servant's discretion was a shield, yes, but also a map. One that Alleyn intended to follow patiently until it led to the heart of the mystery. Alleyn returned to the dormitory wing just as the last echoes of polite murmurs had died away. The assembled guests had withdrawn to the main hall under the pretense of regaining composure, leaving him alone with the silent rows of beds and the lingering, faintly metallic scent of Edmund Stoyle's sudden death. He moved slowly, letting his eyes sweep over the familiar geometries of the old space, his mind attuned to irregularities hidden within habit. It was often in the patterns of daily life, the small habitual gestures that people carried with them like invisible signatures. That truth revealed itself. Alleyn observed the canvas nearest the body, noting the angle at which it had leaned and the faint indentation of the floor. Beneath it, there was nothing dramatic, yet the slight tilt suggested a recent disturbance. A casual observer would see only dust and shadow. Alleyn saw the small friction of human intervention. He stepped closer to one of the beds, its coverlet folded with precise neatness, and touched the edge of the blanket. The gesture was habitual, a simple act of adjustment. Yet he noticed that one corner had been lifted slightly, the mark of a hurried motion not entirely consistent with the usual order of the room. It was a trace almost invisible, and yet it carried the quiet weight of intent. His attention then shifted to the small desk by the window, its surface orderly as always, yet the single sheet of paper lying upon it seemed strangely out of place. Alleyn approached, noting the careful, almost ritualistic manner in which the young men of St. Augustine's had arranged their possessions. The paper bore no obvious message, merely a list of names, dates, and small annotations in a careful hand. And yet one line, crossed lightly with pencil, drew his eye. Edmund Stoyle's name, followed by a number, the same number faintly circled 3 times. Alleyn considered the repetition. It was not uncommon for a young man to make lists, a record of tasks, a tally, a rehearsal of events, but the slight irregularity of the marks, the insistence of the penciled circles, suggested more than habit. It suggested preoccupation, something Edmund had wished to note, to observe, perhaps even to remind himself of. Yet he had never spoken of it aloud. Alleyn rose from the desk, letting his gaze move across the dormitory once more. The beds, the floor, the narrow passageways, all bore the imprint of a carefully maintained routine. And yet subtly, one pattern had been broken, the alignment of a small wooden chair by the window, the faint smudge of dust along the edge of a radiator, the slight tilt of the canvas nearest the body. In these minute deviations, Alleyn recognized the first whisper of human intervention, a disturbance embedded within ritual, unnoticed by the casual observer, but unmistakable to one attuned to the cadence of life in the old school. He leaned slightly, noting the faint scent of cologne, the subtle shift in the air near the open window, the trace of a visitor, or perhaps a passing movement. These were the small, quiet details that rarely drew attention, yet spoke volumes when interpreted correctly. Alleyn knew that the key to understanding what had happened lay not in grand gestures or overt clues, but in the careful observation of what had been altered, however subtly, from the expected routine. From this vantage, he could see the faint scuff on the floorboards, a nearly imperceptible mark that ran from the doorway to the desk. It was slight, but unmistakable, a trace of passage, a single movement out of order, a deviation from the established rhythm of the room. Alleyn's mind, trained to connect such minutiae, began to trace the invisible line between routine and disruption, between habit and deliberate action. He straightened, allowing a quiet smile of understanding to touch his lips. The clue was small, almost insignificant, easily overlooked. Yet it carried meaning sufficient to illuminate the trajectory of events that had led to Edmund Stoyle's death. The subtle dissonance within the dormitory's carefully maintained order was a map, and he intended to follow it patiently, quietly, until the pattern revealed the invisible hand behind the tragedy. Alleyn left the dormitory wing with no more than a gentle step, his mind threading together habit, deviation, and observation. Outside, the faint murmur of voices continued, polite, tentative. Within the small disturbances he had noted, the rhythm of the evening had begun to reveal itself. The first whispers of motive, hidden in the ordinary and waiting imperceptibly to be traced to their source. By the time Alleyn returned to the main hall, the initial shock of Edmund Stoyle's death had begun to settle into a hushed, disciplined tension. Guests murmured quietly, exchanging glances that were polite but wary, as though each wished to gauge the other's reactions before speaking their own. Alleyn allowed them this space, standing slightly apart, observing without intrusion, for he knew that the next fractures in the evening's surface would appear not in words, but in subtle behaviors. It was Clarissa Fielding who first drew his attention. She had retreated to a corner near one of the long windows, and her posture was unusually tense, almost brittle. Alleyn noted the way her gloved hands rested over each other, twisting faintly as though in rehearsal, the flicker of her eyes toward Lady Margaret, and the rapid, almost imperceptible shift of her weight as if preparing for flight. Then quietly, the second disruption of the evening occurred. A disturbance so subtle that only a careful observer could have noticed it. A folded envelope, slipped beneath a silver candlestick on the sideboard, had gone unnoticed by all but Alleyn. Its presence was accidental, yet deliberate. The handwriting was tight, neat, careful, and it bore a small crease that suggested repeated handling. It was the sort of gesture intended to leave a message without the pretense of announcement. Alleyn bent slightly, glancing toward the envelope, then stepped back, allowing the illusion of inattention to remain. He did not open it immediately. He preferred to watch the reactions it might evoke in those nearby. Politeness, he had learned, was brittle in the presence of secrets. The envelope, though unopened, had already begun its work, a quiet ripple of unease passing through the assembled guests. Lady Margaret, upon noticing it, stiffened ever so slightly. Her hand hovered near the candlestick, but she did not touch it. Lord Aubrey's gaze flicked toward her, then quickly away, betraying concern masked by courtesy. Clarissa's eyes were fixed on the envelope, yet her fingers remained clenched. Alleyn's mind quietly noted the hierarchy of attention. The envelope's presence illuminated alliances, anxieties, and suppressed knowledge more clearly than any overt statement. Meanwhile, Sir Julian Rathbone had discovered a minor disorder of his own. The small pile of guest books had been disturbed. He straightened them mechanically, muttering to himself about carelessness, yet Alleyn observed the shadow of irritation and curiosity crossing the officer's lined features. Even in the smallest gestures, the living were revealing themselves. The envelope was not the only subtle collapse. A sudden, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the room when a young alumnus, one of the recent graduates, coughed sharply, drawing attention. The sound was ordinary, yet the startled glances it provoked, the brief stiffening of posture, spoke of a crowd suddenly aware of its own fragility. Fear, carefully concealed, was beginning to thread through the evening. Alleyn, quietly observing, allowed the interactions to unfold without intervention. Each gesture, each hesitation was a clue in its own right. The envelope, the minor misalignments of furniture, the subtle tremors of the human participants. Together, they formed a lattice of observation upon which the truth would eventually be traced. Finally, Alleyn retrieved the envelope, holding it without immediate inspection, allowing its presence to register fully in the room. He noticed that the most minor gestures, a glance downward, a tightened hand, a faint inhale, were amplified in meaning when considered alongside one another. The people of St. Augustine's, accustomed to civility as a shield, were beginning to reveal cracks in their composure. As he held the envelope, Alleyn's mind moved like a careful hand over the contours of the evening. He did not yet know the message within, nor its significance, but he understood that the rhythm of ordinary life had been broken twice, first by Edmund Stoyle's quiet death, and now by this subtle intrusion of communication. The night's tension had shifted imperceptibly, but irreversibly. In the subdued lighting of the hall, Alleyn smiled faintly to himself. The second stirring, quiet, deliberate, almost ceremonious in its subtlety, had set the stage for understanding. The interplay of character, habit, and deviation was beginning to reveal its pattern, and in that pattern, he trusted, lay the next key to unraveling the evening's mystery. By the dim glow of the hall lanterns, Alleyn withdrew slightly from the restless assembly, allowing the faint hum of polite speculation to drift past him. He did not move toward questions or avert investigation. Instead, he allowed himself a rare moment of quiet reflection. The evening, with its delicate balance of civility and unease, had provided more than the usual threads. Subtle signs, small deviations, and gestures pregnant with meaning. He had observed, and now, as always, his mind began to sift them with methodical precision. The first detail that drew his attention was the placement of Lady Margaret's canvases. One, nearer to the body, had been slightly tilted, a motion inconsistent with her usual exacting care. The mark on the floor beneath it suggested it had been moved recently, but with deliberation, almost as though to conceal or reveal something selectively. Such minor disturbance, Alleyn knew, carried more significance than any shouted accusation. Then there was the envelope. Folded neatly, slipped under a candlestick, touched by at least 2 people before he had retrieved it. Its presence, silent yet deliberate, signaled intention and knowledge. Who had placed it? Who had been aware of it? Each motion left subtle traces, from a shadow in a gloved hand to the faint crease left on the polished surface. Alleyn's intuition, trained to interpret these nuances, noted the quiet interplay of deliberate concealment and inadvertent revelation. And the human actors themselves, Clarissa's brittle posture, the way her eyes had lingered a fraction too long on the envelope. Lord Aubrey's carefully controlled attentiveness, almost protective yet anxious. Lady Margaret's pale composure, which masked tension beneath the practiced surface. Even Sir Julian's muttered discontent carried the texture of curiosity and subtle irritation, an undercurrent of concern tempered by habitual authority. Alleyn allowed his mind to trace the invisible web connecting these observations. It was never a single gesture or statement that revealed truth, but the intersection of habit, deviation, and character. A young man's collapse, a slight movement of a canvas, a quietly placed envelope. Each element was a note in an otherwise silent symphony, a code written in civility and restraint. He considered the servants, too. Ethel Briggs and Mrs. Havisham had observed more than they would speak of, yet even in silence, they provided essential bearings. Their restraint was a kind of map. The absence of commentary highlighted what was important precisely because it was withheld. In a household like this, those who served knew the rhythms of both the living and the dead. Observing them was as critical as questioning the witnesses, for their discretion often hid unspoken truths. Alleyn let his thoughts settle like dust upon the scene. He did not yet require confession, evidence, or confrontation. What he sought was clarity of character, a quiet understanding of motive and the patterns of human behavior that spoke more eloquently than words. The murder itself had been silent, the chaos it produced almost imperceptible. Yet within the restraint and precision of the evening, Alleyn discerned the shape of intention. Slowly, he allowed a tentative conclusion to take form, unspoken even to himself at first. Someone present had acted with subtle purpose, moving within the fabric of ordinary routines, bending the ordinary order to a quiet, deliberate end. The second disturbance, the envelope, the minor misalignments, confirmed a mind at work, one familiar with the art of concealed manipulation. Alleyn straightened, his gaze sweeping the hall once more. The assembled guests remained unaware that the evening's mystery had already begun to reveal itself to the careful observer. Their gestures, their silences, their adherence to ritual, all spoke volumes if one knew how to read them. And Alleyn, as always, knew. He did not speak, he did not act. For now the pattern was forming in his mind, silent, patient, inevitable. The room could continue its polite murmurings. The living could conduct their subtle maneuvers. Alleyn, as ever, waited. The quiet logic of human behavior, he reflected, was far more revealing than any outburst of fear or grief. And in that logic, he sensed, lay the pathway to the truth. One patient, deliberate and unavoidable. The evening had grown later, and the remaining guests had returned to the main hall, their voices lowered to murmurs of polite speculation. Lantern light played upon polished surfaces, casting long, gentle shadows across the floor, and the old dormitory wing, emptied of its immediate witness, seemed to exhale the stillness of its secrets. Alleyn lingered at the edge of the hall, his eyes quietly following the subtle movements of the guests. Each gesture, each hesitant glance, spoke more clearly than words ever could. He noted Clarissa Fielding's small adjustments in posture, the way her gloved hands flexed ever so slightly, the way her gaze flicked toward Lady Margaret and Lord Aubrey, only to be quickly averted. It was a nervous choreography, a private language of unease. Alleyn approached her quietly, speaking in a tone that was courteous, unobtrusive, and deliberately unthreatening. "Miss Fielding," he said softly, "might I request a moment of your company? There is no urgency, only a desire for clarity." Clarissa's hands stilled. She met his gaze, hesitation briefly darkening her eyes before she inclined her head. "Of course, Inspector," she murmured, following him toward the quieter end of the hall where a small alcove offered seclusion. Alleyn allowed her to stand comfortably, maintaining the gentle patience that so often encouraged candor. "I wish to understand," he began, "not only what you saw, but how you perceived it. There is no question of blame here, only of truth." Clarissa's gloved fingers tightened lightly around one another. I did see him enter the dormitory. He spoke only briefly about the display. Nothing seemed unusual. And then he collapsed. Her voice was careful, restrained, but Alleyn noted the microsecond of hesitation, the subtle shift of weight, as though she had considered other words, then rejected them. "Did anyone speak to him immediately afterward?" he asked, gently, his tone allowing her space to reveal without pressure. We all came in quickly," she replied. "Lady Margaret, Lord Aubrey, they were close by. Then the others followed, but—" Her voice faltered and she glanced down at her gloved hands, twisting them ever so slightly. "There was something in his manner before that. I cannot say precisely what, but it seemed distracted, anxious, perhaps." Alleyn inclined his head slightly. He was not surprised by her observation. The smallest fluctuation in mood often foreshadowed the subtler truths of motive. "And did you notice anything unusual in the dormitory itself?" Clarissa hesitated, then her eyes drifted toward the alcove wall. "The canvas. It was slightly tilted, not as it usually stands. I thought perhaps someone had moved it to look at the painting more closely. That is all." Alleyn allowed a faint nod, the slight acknowledgement of confirmation rather than confrontation. "Thank you, Miss Fielding. That is very helpful." As he returned to the main hall, he allowed the guests' murmurs to settle around him, observing without interference. Lady Margaret, seated with composure that barely concealed tension, adjusted her shawl, her eyes flicking to the envelope Alleyn had earlier noted. Lord Aubrey, his hand resting lightly upon the table, seemed alert yet polite, cautious in his attentions. Even Sir Julian, leaning slightly forward with habitual authority, carried an air of restrained curiosity. Alleyn's mind traced the invisible lines connecting these small observations. The dormitory had yielded two discrete disturbances, the body and then the envelope. Yet each had left subtle, telling marks in the routines and gestures of those present. He understood, as he often did in such circumstances, that confrontation need not always be public, nor revelation dramatic. Quiet, measured engagement often elicited more truth than any spectacle. By the time the hall settled into a semblance of calm, Alleyn had resolved on his next steps. The evening's events would not be unraveled through loud interrogation or ostentatious discovery. Rather, the truth would emerge through patient observation, careful reflection, and the subtle alignment of behavior and motive. For now, he allowed the semblance of calm to persist. The guests, unaware of the depth of his insight, spoke politely, laughed lightly, and adjusted their seats as though life might continue untroubled. But Alleyn's mind, sharp and measured, was already arranging the invisible pieces of the puzzle. And when the moment arrived, quiet, inevitable, and unforced, the truth would reveal itself with the same delicacy and inevitability that had marked Edmund Stoyle's own passing. The lanterns flickered gently against the oak paneling as Alleyn moved to the center of the hall, where the remaining guests had gathered in a carefully arranged circle of polite attention. He did not raise his voice, nor did he demand eyes upon him. Instead, he allowed the quiet weight of observation to settle naturally, drawing their attention with the subtle authority of one accustomed to being heard without force. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began in measured tones, "we have witnessed an unfortunate event, sudden in its occurrence, yet in some ways anticipated by the subtleties of human behavior. I do not seek to alarm or to accuse hastily. Rather, I wish to recount what has become evident through careful observation and to allow the truth to settle quietly among us." He paused, letting his words hang lightly, their significance understood more through the manner of delivery than through declaration. The guests shifted, adjusting themselves in their chairs and along the edges of the room, subtle unease threading through the cultivated calm. Edmund Stoyle's passing was sudden, yet it was not the product of carelessness nor of random misfortune. The dormitory, its habitual arrangements, the subtle disturbances therein, these all mark the hand of one who knew precisely the rhythms of the evening and the routines of those within it. Alleyn's eyes rested briefly on Clarissa Fielding, whose gloved fingers had unconsciously interlaced. She met his gaze with faint acknowledgement, a mixture of apprehension and composure. The envelope discovered, unnoticed by most until recently, carried its own quiet message. Its placement, delicate and deliberate, signaled knowledge of events unseen, and the careful movements of certain individuals confirmed that attention was paid not only to circumstance, but to opportunity. A breath passed through the hall, polite yet tentative, as listeners digested the gravity of his words without disruption. Alleyn continued, voice even, eyes sweeping the assembly. "It is evident that the person responsible acted with subtlety and precision. The young man's collapse, the minimal disturbance, the careful manipulation of objects, and the absence of outward struggle all suggest an intent quiet, deliberate, and, I regret to say, personally motivated." He allowed a moment of silence, observing the shifting expressions of Lady Margaret, Lord Aubrey, Clarissa, and Sir Julian. Then he spoke again, softly, directing his attention now toward a single figure. "Miss Fielding, I believe you understood the risks of the dormitory routine and, perhaps, the consequence of misapplied vigilance. The evidence of your familiarity with Edmund Stoyle's habits, combined with the subtle alterations in the room's order, is sufficient to indicate knowledge of, and presence at, the crucial moment." Clarissa's hands, long folded, flexed and relaxed, her lips parted, yet no sound issued. The silence itself carried the weight of confession. She inclined her head slightly, a quiet acknowledgement rather than an outburst, an acceptance of inevitability rather than a denial. Alleyn's voice remained, gentle, unshaken by her compliance. "The truth, Miss Fielding, is not something to be feared in its discovery. We act not in anger, but in understanding. The hand that altered the familiar patterns, however subtly, now stands revealed, and the evening may continue, though the knowledge of human frailty and intent must now accompany it." There was no shouting, no dramatic collapse of emotion. Only the soft acknowledgement of what had been hidden in plain sight, the careful alignment of behavior and motive, the quiet inevitability that truth, like dust, settles over even the most polished surfaces. Lady Margaret's pale composure did not falter. Lord Aubrey's hand remained lightly upon the table, his eyes reflective. Even Sir Julian seemed to understand that no outburst would alter what had already occurred. Alleyn allowed the silence to linger, letting the truth breathe and the assembled witnesses absorb it at their own pace. Politeness, he reflected, often concealed more than it revealed, yet it also permitted revelation to unfold with a grace that spectacle could never achieve. Finally, he inclined his head slightly, a gesture of courtesy and closure. The pattern was complete, the mystery unraveled without spectacle, and the quiet authority of reason and observation had delivered clarity where emotion and conjecture might have failed. The hall had settled into a quiet, almost suspended stillness. Alleyn observed the assembled group, noting the delicate shifts of posture, the subtle exchange of glances, the small, telling hesitations that had begun to define the evening's atmosphere. Clarissa Fielding remained near the alcove, her composure regained, though not entirely untroubled, her acceptance of truth tempered by a faint pallor that spoke of inner reckoning. Alleyn, as always, did not rush the consequences of revelation. Justice, he reflected, was not always a matter of immediate punishment. Sometimes it was the inevitable acknowledgement of moral responsibility, the slow collapse of certainty into the quiet weight of understanding. Here, in this room of disciplined civility, such acknowledgement was already occurring. Lady Margaret remained seated with the same restrained elegance, her hands folded in her lap. Her gaze rested briefly on Clarissa, a faint shadow of pity passing through her otherwise calm expression. Lord Aubrey, attentive yet controlled, kept his eyes lowered, a careful consideration of loyalty and discretion in each measured glance. Even Sir Julian, with the authority of his years, seemed to recognize that the conventional forms of censure were unnecessary. The weight of social and personal consequence was already sufficient. Alleyn's own hand rested lightly upon the back of a chair as he addressed the room once more, his tone soft yet imbued with the certainty of observation. It is, perhaps, not always the law that enforces recognition of action, nor the spectacle of punishment that confirms accountability. Sometimes it is the quiet inevitability of understanding, the inescapable alignment of motive, behavior, and consequence that constitutes justice. Clarissa inclined her head slowly, acknowledging his words with a mixture of relief and resignation. She did not protest, nor did she attempt to evade the moral weight of her actions. The hall remained quiet, save for the faint shuffle of fabric as the assembled guests adjusted in their chairs, their awareness that social equilibrium had been disturbed, yet maintained through decorum. Alleyn allowed a moment to pass, letting the atmosphere settle. The events of this evening, he continued, have demonstrated the subtle power of intent and the equally subtle clarity of observation. The balance of civility, expectation, and deviation has shifted, and all who witnessed it may consider the implications in silence, reflection, and discretion. There was no outward punishment, no public shame, no harsh exclamations of guilt. The room absorbed the reality with a quiet, almost ironic inevitability. The pattern of human behavior, once hidden beneath etiquette and habit, had been traced and acknowledged. In that acknowledgement lay a form of justice more enduring than any immediate sanction could provide, a reckoning not of law, but of conscience, perception, and social consequence. Sir Julian rose at last, his tall figure commanding yet tempered by reflection. "Very well," he said, voice measured. "Let us allow the matter to rest for tonight. There is little to be gained by further disturbance." His glance toward Clarissa was brief but pointed, acknowledging both responsibility and restraint. Alleyn nodded, offering no correction, no further remark. The hall, now returned to its subdued rhythm, seemed to exhale collectively, the tension of secrecy and revelation settling into a calm tempered by understanding. The truth, once revealed, had created its own equilibrium, quiet, inevitable, and inescapable. And so, justice, in this instance, was not a matter of arrest or public shame, but the alignment of awareness and consequence, the recognition of subtle causality and human responsibility. Politeness, social decorum, and moral inevitability had converged, leaving all present with the knowledge of truth and the understanding that it would shape their lives henceforth in ways both visible and hidden. The hall was empty now, save for the soft glow of the remaining lanterns and the faint echoes of footsteps that had long since departed. Alleyn lingered near the threshold of the old dormitory wing, his gaze tracing the long lines of polished floorboards, the carefully aligned beds, and the shadows that clung to the corners like quiet witnesses. The evening had concluded with no ceremony, no dramatic confession, only the subdued acknowledgement of truth and the fragile equilibrium restored among the living. He allowed himself a slow exhalation, the kind that followed careful observation and silent deduction. There was a peculiar satisfaction in the quiet resolution of events, a satisfaction not born of triumph but of understanding. The human machinery had revealed its hidden patterns, and the inevitability of consequence had been acknowledged in manners as measured as the life of the old school itself. Alleyn moved to one of the windows, resting a hand lightly against the cool glass. Outside, the night was still, the moon casting a pale glow across the grounds. In that stillness, he found a metaphor for the evening, a world that seemed serene on the surface, yet beneath it, currents of thought, intention, and subtle disturbance had flowed with quiet insistence. He thought of Edmund Stoyle, whose sudden departure had set these currents in motion. The young man had left no note, no cry, no outward sign of forewarning. And yet, in the manner of his passing, and in the reactions of those who remained, the intricacies of human character had been laid bare. There was something poetic in that, the silent revelation of truth, the delicate unraveling of pretense, and the persistent, inevitable imprint of conscience. Alleyn's gaze wandered over the empty hall once more. The envelope, the subtle scuffs, the minor misalignments, all now held their place in the pattern he had traced. Nothing was lost, nothing overlooked, for those who moved within the rhythms of life and observation left traces, however faint, that the perceptive mind could read. He allowed a faint smile, private and unspoken, to touch his lips. Justice had been served in its quiet, inevitable way. There had been no dramatic arrests, no shouting proclamations, no theatrical unraveling of secret plots. Only understanding and the slow, certain knowledge that human intention, however concealed, would ultimately meet awareness. Alleyn turned finally, leaving the dormitory wing and its soft shadows behind. As he walked through the corridors toward the quiet streets beyond, his mind lingered on the evening's subtle lessons. Civilization, he thought, was built upon the delicate interplay of civility, observation, and restraint. And within that interplay, human nature, with all its quiet ambitions, hidden resentments, and restrained passions, revealed itself most clearly when examined not in the clamor of accusation, but in the soft silence of reflection. Outside, the night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of frost and the distant, muted sounds of the sleeping town. Alleyn's coat brushed lightly against his legs as he paused, lantern in hand, and considered the invisible threads that had bound the evening together. In the end, he reflected, it was the quietest events that often spoke the loudest. A collapse in a dormitory, a carefully placed envelope, a gesture unnoticed by all but the observant eye. And in that quiet, as always, lay the truth. He walked on, the soft crunch of his boots on the gravel, a gentle punctuation to the night's stillness, and in that calm he felt once more the serene satisfaction of having read the silent currents of human behavior, and of having allowed the world to continue with its fragile, inevitable grace.